Okay, there we go. So I guess I'll get the ball rolling. I'm not going to be presenting tonight. Tonight, our presenter is going to be Missy Tremmel, and she's going to be talking about treaty issues and how we interact with the tribes. And with that, I'm going to turn off my camera and mute myself.
And I'm going to hopefully get my presentation going. And also turn off my camera because I distract myself. Okay, can everybody see it?
Yep.
Yes.
We can see it.
Okay. Yeah, so like Tom said, I'm going to talk about treaty rights. When I talk about that, I'm just really talking about the right to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded lands. And so before I get going, I just want to make it clear that I'm by no means an expert on this topic, but I think I got selected to give it just because I've been around and involved in Mille Lacs for longer than most of the other people. So this is presentation is pretty much a summary of things that I've learned over the years. So first of all, I'll just kind of kick it off with why do treaties matter? And there's a bunch of reasons, and some of them are that treaties recognize the Indian tribes as sovereign nations, and treaties are as valid today as they were on the day they were signed and ratified. And they're especially important in Minnesota because 1 out of every 10 treaties ever signed by the U.S. with American Indians involved people and land in what is now Minnesota. And most of the land that is now Minnesota was ceded to the U.S. by the Ojibwe and Dakota people. And it was over a pretty brief period of time, pretty much between 1837 and 1867. And so before I jump into some more details, I'm just going to kind of go through some, define a few terms and just kind of cover some background stuff. So when the U.S. was founded, the tribes were self-governing sovereign nations, and their power to self-government and sovereign status were not fully extinguished by the Constitution. And so they're considered sovereign nations under the Constitution and federal laws. And the establishment of the U.S. subjected tribes to federal power, but it never eliminated their internal sovereignty or made them subordinate to, oops. What is that? What happened?
It looks like your presentation stopped sharing.
That's a new one. That's never happened before. No, this says it's Peter Perovich's screen.
Oh. So Peter, up on the upper right by the leave button, there's like a box with an arrow. If you can click on that, it'll say stop sharing. If you can get back into your Teams screen where you see us.
I will.
Okay.
Go back again.
Did it stop?
Yep.
Okay. Are we good?
Okay. Can everybody see the slides again?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, great. So okay, so where is that? Okay, so the tribes retained their power for self-government over their lands and their members, and they were never made subordinate to the powers of state government. So that's kind of is all tied into that whenever you hear that tribes are sovereign nations. So those are some of the factors that go along with that. And so states have no authority to govern over tribal governments unless it's expressly authorized by Congress. So just a few kind of terms that you kind of hear that people might use interchangeably, but they're really not interchangeable. So kind of American Indian, that's when you hear that term, that's more of they're talking about race. It's more of a social construct, and it's just a person having origins in any of the indigenous peoples of America. But when you get to tribe is usually the larger political unit, so a nation. So it can either be in Minnesota, it's apologize if I can never pronounce this right, Anishinaabe or the Dakota. And then band is a smaller group within a nation, and it's usually by location. So Leech Lake Band, Fond du Lac Band, Mille Lacs Band. And so I just kind of to go through, like I said, there was that 30-year period where there was a lot of land was ceded. And so again, this is kind of the map of all that kind of shows the treaties of ceded lands from the Ojibwe between 1830 and 1860. And again, the treaties are with the federal government and they're with individual tribes and bands. All treaties ceded land. Some of the treaties created reservations, and some of the treaties reserved hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on ceded territories. And the key thing to remember at the time, the states often didn't exist at the time of the signing of the treaty. And treaties in ceded territories cross state lines. But they were with the federal government. So, that's the other thing, just to keep remembering the treaties are with the federal government. Okay, so and then some other common terms that are out there. So reservation is on land that was reserved for a tribe or tribes in exchange for ceded territory, and it's held in trust by the federal government. With the exception in Minnesota of Red Lake. Red Lake never ceded their land that they're on right now. And harvest rights on reservations are implicit unless federal law says they're not. But in a ceded territory is land that was surrendered in exchange for payment through treaties with the federal government. And harvest rights in ceded lands are not implicit. So in Minnesota, there's two broad communities again, the Anishinaabe and the Dakota. And the 7 Anishinaabe reservations were established by treaty and are considered separate and distinct nations by the United States government. And the 4 Dakota communities that are in Minnesota were also established by treaty in 1851, but that was revoked after the conflict of 1862. But then the community, it was reestablished by an act of Congress in 1886. So on reservation rights for hunting, fishing, and gathering, like I said, they don't need to be expressly reserved in the treaty. The right to hunt, fish, and gather are implied on tribally owned lands. And on these lands, the bands regulate their own members on the tribal land within the reservation. Federal government can also regulate, but then states can regulate non-band members, but not tribal members. And this applies again for hunting, fishing, and gathering. It's different with timber and water. And so once you get to off reservation rights, they must be expressly reserved in a treaty. The bands and to have the rights, the band must be signatory to the treaty, and the rights are held in common by the bands. They may only exercise treaty rights on public lands within the ceded territory. And it must, the rights must, not to have rights, they must be expressly extinguished within the treaty. So that's another key thing. It must be, if for a treaty, it must expressly extinguish those rights. So, when it comes to interpreting the treaties, the U.S. Supreme Court established the federal trust relationship between the federal government and the American people. And they came up, the trust relationship provides that any treaties, agreements, laws, or administrative decisions are presumed to benefit American Indians. So there are special rules of interpretation for federal laws and treaties that affect American Indians. These rules are referred to as the canons of construction. And so the the main points of it that are treaties are construed as American Indians understood them at the time. Any doubts concerning the meaning of the treaties are resolved in favor of the American Indians. And the explicit language or or clear congressional intent is required to revoke any treaty rights. And that the court would kind of looks beyond the written word to the broader context of the treaty, looking back at history, negotiations, and kind of the conditions at the time. So, and that was, again, like I said, this is these guidelines were developed by the Supreme Court. Okay, so getting back to kind of focusing in on Lake Mille Lacs. As you're all aware, the lake is located within the 1837 ceded territory and subject to the Treaty of 1837. And kind of just to go over the kind of the timeline. So there was Treaty of 1837 was the first of several cession treaties which sold large tracts of land in north central and eastern Minnesota. These treaties specified the rights to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded territory. And the signatories of the 1837 treaty are the Mille Lacs Band, Fond du Lac Band, and 6 Wisconsin bands. And in 1990, the Mille Lacs Band filed suit seeking to exercise those treaty rights. And then in 95 and 96, Fond du Lac and the 6 Chippewa bands joined the suit. The district court heard this in 1994 and confirmed that those rights still exist. And that's what we call phase 1. And then the states and the bands entered into a stipulated agreement in 1996 that governs the working relationship between the state and the bands, and that was considered phase 2. It was appealed to the 8th Circuit Court, and that court agreed that in 1997 that the rights still existed. And then it went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1999, which reaffirmed the lower court rulings. And so to go through the this in a little bit more detail. So phase 1 again, affirmed the band's right to hunt, fish, and gather, that those rights had not been extinguished. Phase 2 was dealt with the allocation of the resource in ceded territory outside of the reservation. Again, we mentioned the stipulated agreement, and I'll talk about them in more detail too. And those that stipulated agreement was incorporated into the court order. And the stipulated agreement governs how the state and the bands work together. What has not been litigated has been who's the primary manager of the resource and the percent of the resource the bands are entitled to. And so, more details on phase 1. The treaty intended to allow hunting, fishing, and gathering off reservation, and permit the use of this privilege for was not limited to any particular method or gear. So, and also the other thing to note is that the treaty intended to permit continued use of the privilege for commercial purposes. Even at the time, the band members were engaged in trade and with settlers and lumbermen, and this kind of went into the interpretation of the treaty. And again, another key thing is that it was not limited to the use of any particular type of technique, method, gear, season. And so, at the time the treaty was signed, there were already rifles and other Euro-American technology already being used. And again, there's nothing that in the treaty that would indicate that their bands would be confined to any particular technique, methods, or devices. So a common question that we often get is, can the state regulate the band's harvest method? And the general answer is nope. No, the state cannot, because the bands are not subject to state law and are not limited by time, place, or manner of fishing. There are a couple exceptions that the state can regulate the privilege in the interest of conservation if it can be demonstrated that the regulation is reasonable and necessary. Its application to the Indians is necessary in the interest of conservation, and that the state has taken all other measures to address the issue through regulation of non-banned harvest. And what this means is if there was a conservation concern that before the state could regulate the band's fishery, the state would have to do everything in its power to help alleviate that conservation concern up to and including closing the state's fishery. Okay, so and then like phase 2, as like I mentioned, is big thing. Part of phase 2 is allocation of the resource. Or that was one of the things that the court has not made a decision on. So as so and the court is free to kind of just, it was so what the court basically said at the time, it didn't think it needed to determine if or set the allocation. And there's a lot of stuff related to the definition of equitable relief. And the courts really don't like to do this. Because it must establish that a party's right to a fair share has been substantially or irreparably injured as a result of the other party's harvest of such a resource. But the thing to note is that in other cases where allocation has been decided by the court, it was a 50% split. And so the working assumption is 50%. So some states where the court has made the allocation determination as Washington State and Wisconsin, and both of those states it was determined to be 50%. So, and the other unresolved or part that wasn't litigated was who has management authority of the resource. Again, the court declined to address this. And generally the state's assumption is that the bands manage their harvest and the state manages the resource. But the state has a trust responsibility and the authority to manage natural resources for the benefit of all current and future users consistent with treaty harvest rights of the bands. And so including the band's right to regulate, protect band member harvest opportunities as affirmed by the courts. And again, phase 2, a part of the phase 2 agreement was the protocols, which govern the working relationship between the state and the bands. And another important thing to remember is the continuing jurisdiction of the court. So by agreement of the state and the bands, the federal district court has continuing jurisdiction to address any disputes that might arise under the court's final order, and this includes the protocols. So any issue that must first go through the dispute resolution process that's first set forth in the protocols. So the state just cannot decide that it's wants to go back to court over anything related to 1837 unless it's in hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. It must first follow the process laid out by the protocols for when the two parties can't come to consensus. And so kind of how does this all play into the management of Mille Lacs? And so kind of historically, Mille Lacs was managed very similar to all the other fisheries in the state. So between about 1900 and the 1990s, the state was the regulator, and stakeholders provided input into regulations. So kind of pretty much like it is in many of the other lakes still in the state. Like I said, the court decision added the Mille Lacs Band, Fond du Lac Band, and the 6 Wisconsin bands to the management dynamics on Mille Lacs. And so unlike the state's relationship with stakeholders, where the state is the governing authority, the relationship between the state and the bands is different. It's government to government. So it's a very different dynamic. Okay, so I've talked about these stipulated agreements, and this was part of part of the documents that are associated with the court decision. You know, there's hundreds of pages of documents, but the stipulated agreements are kind of the key parts that directly influence how DNR in the management of the fishery. So again, in these stipulated agreements, it was actually worked out before the phase 2 court decision, but the court incorporated these stipulations into the court order, meaning that they must be followed unless the parties agree, both parties, so that would be the state and the bands, agree that they want them changed. So again, the stipulated agreement had 4 key parts. It said that the bands needed to have a model code. So this is their conservation code, and the bands, it's a very detailed document that talks about how the bands manage their harvest. So, and then also one of the key agreements is commissioner's order, and this is the commissioner for the bands, and this isn't the state's commissioner's order. And then the bands need to have management plans, and so in the early part of the after the court decision, the management plans tended to be 5-year plans, but in recent years they've been annual plans. But the bands submit those to the state annually, along with declarations of harvest. And then the last part of the stipulated agreement are the 5 protocols, and again, these govern how the state and the bands coordinate harvest and manage the resources in the 1837 ceded territory. And again, the stipulations are they must be followed unless both the state and the bands agree to wanting to change any particular part of them. So I'm going to talk about protocols 1, 4, and 5, because those are the ones related to fisheries within the 1837 ceded territory. Protocols 2 and 3 deal with wildlife issues. So protocol 1 sets up the Fisheries Technical Committee, which I think everybody in MILFAC has heard about. And so it also determines the structure and function of the FTC. And again, the FTC operates by consensus. So if consensus can't be achieved by the members of the FTC, then the dispute resolution process is invoked. And this has 3 stages. The first thing is if there's an issue that the FTC can't come to agreement on, that issue is kind of kicked up to the state and band leadership, and they try to figure out a way to resolve the issue. But if they can't come to consensus, then either party can call for mediation. And then if the issue can't be resolved through mediation, the court can be invoked. And so okay, so the next protocol is protocol 4, and that's how information is exchanged. And it outlines the responsibilities and obligations for both the state and the bands for sharing information. And it talks about some of the things that are covered in protocol 4 is just, for example, it's like it outlines how the different fisheries are harvest in population assessments and things like that. And it also talks about how if either the state or the bands want to change the regulation or management within any water body within the 1837 ceded territory, they need to notify the other party by writing, and that has to include an explanation and rationale for the proposed change. And they're supposed to do this 60 days in advance, and then the other party has 30 days to respond. And protocol 5 is kind of the big one. It directly influences how harvest levels are set for treaty managed species. It defines responsibilities and methodology. And it clearly states that both parties agree to manage their respective fisheries to remain within their respective shares of the harvestable surplus. And so again, probably all aware of managed species are walleye, perch, cisco, burbot, northern pike, and muskie. And the methods can range from very complex, how the harvest levels are determined for Mille Lacs walleye, to relatively simple for how the methods for how walleye or northern pike limits are set for other inland lakes. And again, also in Protocol 5, it states that the state and the bands were required to develop a process to deal with quota overruns. And this was something that because back at the time the bands started fishing in the state, the process started, it was new to everybody, and so there was a 3-year grace period for or kind of basically to kind of see how things went, and to develop a method to deal with quota overruns. And if you remember, I said Protocol 1 defines the dispute resolution process for when consensus can't be reached. And this process actually was invoked back in 2002, and it was related to this part of the protocol that said the state and the bands must develop a process for dealing with quota overruns. At the time, so in 2000, we couldn't come to an agreement on how to deal with quota overruns, and it went all the way through mediation. And then the dispute resolution process was also invoked again in 2017 after the state exceeded its share of the harvestable surplus during the 2016 fishing year and didn't close the fishery. So then in 2017, the state and the bands could not agree on how to address this overage and to move forward. And that time, it was the dispute resolution process was invoked, but we were able to come to consensus. The state and band leaders were able to come to consensus on how to address the overrun. There's an attachment to Protocol 5 that deals specifically with the harvestable surplus methodologies for fish within the 1837 ceded territory. And this is pretty much where it directly deals with the walleye fishery in Mille Lacs. And the main parts of it are it discusses the methodology for stock assessment process. So basically coming up with how many fish are out there, harvest strategy, coming up with how many fish can be safely removed, and then harvest tactics, how those fish are removed. And tribal fishery typically is gillnet spear and spearing with a little bit of angling. And as you know, the state is a angling fishery. And again, this process was kind of stock assessment process was very common, based on common methods used in marine fisheries at the time of the court case. And historically, there was a harvest control rule written into the protocols. And I don't know if folks have heard, it was like 24% of the vulnerable biomass was the method used to determine how many fish could be safely removed initially. But like I said, the policy, because the protocols were set up in such a way that the policy and methodology stated within the protocols can be changed if all parties agree. And this is one of the areas where it was agreed by all members of the FTC that method wasn't working, it wasn't sustainable. And that's kind of so the methodology for setting safe harvest level has changed over time, and it was set up because at the time it was set up to be adaptable to new information, new technologies, and new methodologies that will be developed over time. So as we learn more about the fishery and how to manage it, so that we could adapt. Again, so the protocol sets some pretty detailed sideboards for the collaborative management by the state and the bands within the ceded territory. But there's still a lot of work there's still a lot of work that goes into setting the harvest level in the regulations, state regulations. And this diagram kind of shows the general framework. It's a very iterative process that involves assessing the population and the fishery, estimating the population size, calculating the harvestable surplus, evaluating regulation options, and then set the regulations and kind of just repeat this process every year. And you can see kind of the area in the green circle is like, this is a good chunk of the process, involves working closely with the bands, primarily through the 1837 Fisheries Technical Committee, and then the modeling subcommittee that's also part of a subset of the technical committee. And so a little bit of detail on the Fisheries Technical Committee. Again, it was established under Protocol 1, and its purpose was to promote communication between the state and the bands regarding how natural resources were managed in the ceded territory. It's composed of fisheries scientists and managers, other state and federal experts necessary as needs arrive. So we occasionally bring in outside experts. Enforcement is also part of this of the committee. And again, its function is to discuss fisheries harvest and survey data, to coordinate surveys, and to recommend harvest levels. Again, operates by consensus, and if the consensus can't be reached, it goes through the dispute resolution process. And then there's also back in 2012, when the population was declining, the technical committee established a modeling subgroup to work together on technical issues. And this group is made up of kind of the number crunchers of both the bands and the state. And this group works together on technical issues and try to keep it independent of policy issues. And it's resulted in, this group has been very productive, and it's resulted in kind of streamlining and an improvement in our modeling and analyses, and allows us to it's improved the trust in the biology and science part of the process. So kind of just to wrap it up, although the court decision affirming the fishing rights of the bands that were signatory to the treaty is added to the complexity of managing Mille Lacs, but really the science part isn't as challenging as the parts related to trust and communication issues, and and those are all big parts of fisheries management. So I think some of the issues that come up are the differing values and misunderstanding that occur. And so these things can't be resolved with data. We can't number crunch our way out of it, and they can only be improved by working together in that open, honest environment, and that respects the different values and risk tolerances. So, and that's a big part, I think, of how this group that you folks are all participating on will help that process. So, and that's all I have.
Okay, thanks, Missy. So I guess at this point, if you guys have any questions about, what Missy presented, I think this would be a great opportunity to ask her, because she doesn't normally come to our meetings. So this is your opportunity to try to get some clarifications on some of these issues.
Missy, this is Peter. Can you bring that map back up you had for the treaties?
This one?
Yeah. Yep. So I'm just curious, because it looks like part of Mille Lacs is in the 1855 treaty. Is that correct?
1854.
Or is it 1850?
Yeah, here.
So how does that affect?
Oh, no, sorry, you're right, 1855.
Yeah, 1855. So what is the difference in the two treaties? I mean, I guess I'm curious to how this is affecting lake management. Or is this the same band? If you understand what I'm trying to say, I hope.
Not really. I'm not familiar with 1855.
Because what the management now on the lake is strictly done with the 1837 treaty. But it looks like part of the lake is not in that treaty. So I'm just kind of curious about that. On how that works.
That's I don't actually have I don't know the answer to that one.
And that's fine. I guess I didn't really expect you to have a solid answer to that, but
yeah.
I guess it's something that.
Yeah.
This is Kelly. I believe that's just how it looks on the map, but when you look at the language, it explains the geographic landmarks, and I think it explains that it encompasses the lake.
Oh.
Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that I'll check. I'll verify that, but that would make sense.
Okay. So it could just be the way the map was drawn.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right.
Yeah, because that's a good point. Because I don't. At the time, I can't imagine it was big. Yeah, there'd be a splitting of a lake in the language.
Steve, I think you're muted. He's trying to say something.
There we go. I think there's probably more significance here with respect to the land resources rather than the lake itself. So while this projection that we're looking at here may be correct, it might speak more to, let's say, the game and forestry and whatnot, the land. That's just my guess.
Yeah, but that's a good question. I'm actually kind of surprised it's the first time I've gotten that question. So thanks for stumping me.
Yeah, I kind of noticed it the other day when I was looking this stuff over, and I was like, that's interesting. If that map is drawn correctly, then there's got to be an answer to why that portion of the lake is still being managed with the 1837 treaty. So, and then just a curious question, you may not have an answer either, or you may have a simple answer. Why is it that with what you showed us, the bands with that treaty, why is it that they aren't interested in helping manage other bodies of water within the treaty? Only Mille Lacs. I mean, doesn't it really, from what you showed us, it almost looks like they have the right to help manage, or they're part of that?
Well, they do, I mean, they do have a management plan. It includes other lakes within the 1837 ceded territory, and there is work between that takes place within the FTC for determining harvest levels in the lakes that they're interested in fishing that are not Mille Lacs lakes.
So they're basically really only interested in those bodies of water that they actually possibly would own land on, or within the reservation, I should say. Or
well, no, these those other lakes are outside of the reservation, but within the 1837 territory.
right, because I know
Yes.
one in particular being Lower Dean. I know they have land there, but I know it's within that. I think it's within that, or maybe it's in the 1855. Might be too far north. Because they do a lot of rice harvesting on Lower Dean. And I guess part of my curiosity here is how or why the band would be picking and choosing certain bodies of water to be involved in. I know it's a simple answer. It's just my curiosity is all it is. When they do have actually a broader decision making than what they're actually using.
I mean, they are exercising their rights on, it's quite a lengthy list of other lakes.
Yeah, you'll actually see a list of what their expected or potential take is from many of the small lakes elsewhere within this area.
And are these lakes that this list of lakes, is this something that the state of Minnesota is managing and stocking with walleyes?
I believe some of them are, but the bands also have been, they've been getting into walleye culture also, and there's been some, I know it was a few years ago, I haven't heard about, there's some sharing of fish, I believe, from there. Tom, do you know that, Heinrich? Are they still doing that?
Yeah, I just saw an email the other day between the Little Falls Fisheries Management Area and the Mille Lacs Band.
Yeah.
And they were talking about, I can't remember which lake it was, but the email was going back and forth on how many walleye were going to be stocked. And I know the Mille Lacs Band said that if the state couldn't come up with whatever they wanted to do for whatever reason, that they would try to provide those additional fish to meet the stocking goals.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So they're sharing in it. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's within the area offices within the, there's communication among the Mille Lacs DNR and our DNR, so yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Melissa, this is Larry Daler.
Yeah.
I have a question concerning the booking mortality on Mille Lacs Lake. Does that come from that protocol number 5, attachment A? You said covered harvest on Mille Lacs Lake. And is that covered then by an agreement within there between the state and the tribes involved? Or how did that come about?
That at the time of setting up the original process for determining the state is obligated to state and bands are obligated to, as accurately as possible, share and record, account for their total kill. And at the time it was determined that, you know, hooking mortality is in bycatch is real. So that's part of the process, and it's common for stock. In stock assessments, it's just part of, you have to account for all of the kill.
All right. But that seems to be where a lot of the controversy comes surrounding Mille Lacs Lake, is that process doesn't seem to be used at any other location where there's
It's used in Red Lake. In tallying our total kill in Red Lake, we account for hooking mortality.
Okay.
And we do on other lakes too. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. It just doesn't, you don't hear about it as much on these other systems.
Thank you.
Yep. But it is included, it is in Creel reports of other systems.
With regard to that, as long as we're talking about the hooking mortality, is the same approach, statistical approach and everything used on the other lakes?
Yeah. It's a model.
So it remains real conservative on the other lakes as it is on Mille Lacs.
Yeah. I believe it's like, Tom, which lake did we, is it Lake of the Woods, or is it that has a depth component?
Oh, that was Rainy.
Rainy, yeah, okay. Yeah, so that one, Rainy has its own, a different model that's used on Rainy, but that was developed on Rainy, yeah.
Couple other, they're probably little things here. The one slide referred to overage by the state. There is never any issue with overage by the band, or are they able to control their harvest such that they basically cut off the netting and spearing?
Yeah, that historically to date has been the case, and it's a daily, there's a process that's like, they report I think that total catch has to be reported within 24 hours. So it's like, it's very tracked, more real time than we're able to do with an open access angling fishery. So
Okay.
They can control, if they were to get close to their share of the harvestable surplus, they would be able to restrict the permits and I think they call them permits, that have to be obtained and daily to go out and net, or spear.
Okay. Just the other thing I was thinking about was the population assessments that are done are what the state and the band does. Is it duplicative? Do they do their own netting of fish as well? And
For assessment or for surveying, do you mean?
yeah, surveying and getting at the population estimate.
No, the surveys are pretty much, they do their own electrofishing in the spring and fall for juvenile fish, but the primary gillnet survey that's used in the stock assessment models that both the bands and the state use is our fall survey. And the population, the mark recapture population estimates that we do periodically, we do get some assistance from Mille Lacs Band, Fond du Lac, and Glyphwick for that. So that's there is some assistance and working together on those. And we also do our fall electrofishing for juvenile fish. So, but there's not a lot of redundancy in the surveying.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to get at. We often, I am up on the north side, let's just say near Wealthwood, and we often, on some years, we see netting going on right after opener. Would anybody typically does that fit with anything that either the state or the band would be doing? We see nets set out in front of our area on occasion.
It could possibly be our mark recapture if it's not every year that you
Okay.
see. Yeah, because it's like when we do the mark recapture population estimates, we kind of marking fish right at ice out with trap nets and electrofishing, and then the recapture is with short set gill nets. So they set a gill net just for, I don't know, how long are they out there? They're not even out there an hour, are they, Tom?
No, we try to keep it down to like 30 minutes to
Yeah.
let something.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, the fish are released alive.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
one of those things when people at the resort see it, there's a lot of speculation as to what it is. So, okay.
Yeah, and to clarify, when I say the we, I'm reading Tom and all the other folks because I'm not out there. I'm dry and warm in my office.
Yeah. So Tom's at the heart of all problems, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is Larry Daler. I got a question. If both the state and the tribes share get their data basically from the state, why are there a difference in what is the harvestable amount, and if shouldn't they both be able, sometimes it seems like the tribes will come up with a lower amount and the state comes up higher. If they're both using the same data, how can that be a substantial difference? And then if we're looking at 24% of the biomass being harvestable, shouldn't the two sides be relatively close if they're both looking at the same data?
Oh, yeah, sorry, maybe I confused you. We're not using that 24% value anymore. That was, we stopped using that back in 2012 when things started to decline and the systems began changing. That value was not conservative enough. And so now when the harvest level is set, it's like we have been the past probably since about 2013, we use the same model to get the estimate of the population out there. Where the difference comes in with the bands often wanting a lower value is that's where I was talking about there's different risk tolerances, and they're much more reluctant to have a harvest level that may result in a projected decline in the population.
Okay, so the total amount of fish, basically,
Yeah.
they would be agreeable on what the total number is. It's how much of that total number is harvestable. That's the main disagreement or part that's resolved.
Yeah. And that's been but prior to when we put together that modeling subgroup, prior to that, actually, there would be just disagreements on the number of fish out there because we weren't working together on that part, and so there would be disagreements on their different assumptions would go into the models that were used to estimate the population. And so that was one of the, in my opinion, a positive thing that occurred is when we put together that subgroup and started working together on just a smaller group that just is worried. It's just working on the science biology part of it and trying not to have those other factors that occur after we get the estimate.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, it's getting pretty quiet here. So I guess if you guys have any more questions, now's your opportunity, because otherwise we can end this. Okay. Well, I appreciate your participation, Missy, and I appreciate the folks that showed up and listened. And hopefully this adds a little clarity to, to when we have our discussions at our MILFAC meetings, and we don't have to try to reinvent how the state relates to the tribes, because that really doesn't get us anywhere at our meetings.
And I'm going to try to track. I'm going to look into your question, Peter, because now I'm curious.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So
Yeah, thanks.
okay. Yep. So next week we'll go back more into. I think next week's talk is going to be our sampling techniques, and we'll talk about that and what they mean, and some of the trends that we've seen in the fish populations that we monitor. Okay, and with that, I appreciate your participation, and good night.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.